The gunshot echoed through the dusty streets of Oklahoma City, Oklahoma Territory, as Grace Cooper flinched at the sound, her pale green eyes watching from her bedroom window as Sheriff Tanner dragged another outlaw to the jailhouse. It was May 1889, just weeks after the land run had transformed this place from an empty prairie to a bustling frontier town. For Grace, it had been a desperate new beginning after escaping Philadelphia with little but her dignity intact, and even that had been in tatters. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the muddy street as Grace pinned her honey blonde hair tightly against her head. At 26, she was considered by many to be approaching spinsterhood, but after what Charles Blackstone had done to her back east, she'd gladly embrace that label rather than trust another man's promises. "Miss Cooper," Mrs. Holloway's voice called from downstairs. "The supply wagons just arrived from Wichita. Would you mind helping with the inventory?" Grace sighed, straightening her plain work dress. "Coming, Mrs. Holloway." The general store had become Grace's sanctuary these past 3 months. Old Widow Holloway had given her not only employment but a small room above the shop. It wasn't much, but it was honest work, something Grace had come to value more than the fine dresses and society parties she'd once known. As she descended the narrow staircase, the bell above the shop door jingled. A tall figure ducked through the entrance, silhouetted against the evening light. His broad shoulders and the distinct outline of a cowboy hat made Grace instinctively tense. "Afternoon, Mrs. Holloway," came a deep, resonant voice that carried the hint of a southern drawl. "Got your message about those fence posts coming in. Lucas, perfect timing," Mrs. Holloway beamed, her weathered face crinkling with genuine pleasure. "Grace, dear, come meet Lucas Young, best rancher in the territory if you ask me, though he'd never admit it himself." The man turned toward her, and Grace found herself facing the most striking blue eyes she'd ever seen. They were the color of a summer sky, set in a sun-bronzed face that spoke of years working outdoors. A faint scar traced his jawline, which was covered with several days' growth of beard. He wasn't conventionally handsome, but there was something magnetic about his weathered features. "Madam," he said simply, touching the brim of his hat in a gesture of respect. Grace nodded stiffly. "Mr. Young. Lucas runs the Broken Arrow Ranch about 10 miles west of town, Mrs." Holloway continued, seemingly oblivious to the tension emanating from Grace. "Started from nothing 4 years ago and now has one of the finest herds in the territory." The cowboy looked uncomfortable with the praise, shifting his weight slightly. "Just been fortunate is all." His gaze lingered on Grace with quiet curiosity, but without the predatory assessment she'd grown accustomed to from men. "Grace here is my salvation," Mrs. Holloway continued cheerfully. "Don't know how I managed this place before she arrived, sharp with numbers and never forgets a customer." "Mrs. Holloway is too kind," Grace replied, moving behind the counter to put distance between herself and the cowboy. "The fence posts came on today's wagon. Would you like me to show you?" Lucas nodded, following her to the storeroom at the back of the shop. Grace was acutely aware of his presence, the scent of leather, horses, and open prairie that seemed to surround him. He moved with the easy confidence of a man accustomed to hard work and open spaces. "How many did you need, Mr. Young?" she asked, keeping her tone professionally detached. 2 dozen should do it. Had a section of the north pasture fence knocked down in that storm last week." His voice was like rough velvet, deep and measured. "You're new to Oklahoma City." It wasn't a question, but Grace answered anyway. "I arrived with the land run." A partial truth that revealed nothing of importance. Lucas studied her for a moment, those piercing blue eyes seeming to look right through her carefully constructed facade. "It's rough country for someone on their own." Grace stiffened. "I'm perfectly capable of managing my affairs, Mr. Young." A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Never suggested otherwise, Miss Cooper." For the next few minutes, they worked in silence, counting fence posts and loading them onto a small handcart. Lucas moved with surprising grace for such a large man, his movements efficient and purposeful. "That should do it," he said finally. "I'll bring my wagon around back to load these." Grace nodded, ready to retreat to the safety of the shop's counter, but Lucas spoke again. "Town's having a social Saturday next, raising money for the new schoolhouse." He cleared his throat. "Good way to meet folks if you've a mind to. Thank you for the information, Mr. Young, but I don't attend such gatherings." Lucas studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. "Fair enough, just thought I'd mention it." He touched his hat again. "Pleasure meeting you, Miss Cooper." Grace watched him leave, telling herself the flutter in her stomach was merely caution, not interest. Men like Lucas Young, handsome, confident, capable, were the most dangerous kind. They made a woman believe in safety, only to prove that safety was just another illusion. The days passed with the grinding predictability that Grace had come to appreciate. Each morning she rose before dawn, helped Mrs. Holloway prepare the store for opening, and lost herself in the rhythm of commerce. Keeping ledgers, stocking shelves, and serving customers occupied her mind and left little room for dwelling on the past or worrying about the future. By Friday, Grace had nearly forgotten about Lucas Young and his mention of the town social. Nearly, but not completely. Something about those sky-blue eyes had lingered in her memory, popping unbidden into her thoughts at odd moments. "You should reconsider going tomorrow," Mrs. Holloway said as they closed the shop that evening. "The whole town will be there. Good food, some music. Even dancing if Pastor Williams doesn't object too strenuously." The older woman chuckled. Grace shook her head. "I appreciate the suggestion, but I'm quite content to spend a quiet evening with my book." Mrs. Holloway gave her a penetrating look. "You can't hide forever, child." "I'm not hiding," Grace protested, even as she recognized the lie in her words. "I simply prefer my own company." Mrs. Holloway hummed, clearly unconvinced. "Well, suit yourself. But remember, not every man is like whoever hurt you back east." Grace startled. "I never said—" "You didn't have to, dear. These old eyes have seen enough heartbreak to recognize it." The widow patted her hand gently. "Just think about it, that's all I ask." That night, Grace lay awake in her small bed, listening to the distant sounds of the town, a dog barking, the occasional shout of laughter from the saloon down the street, the creaking of the building as it settled. Mrs. Holloway's words echoed in her mind. "Not every man is like whoever hurt you back east." Charles Blackstone's handsome face flashed before her eyes, those aristocratic features twisted in cruel amusement as he'd revealed his true intentions. The son of her father's business partner, Charles had courted her for months, winning her heart with thoughtful gestures and passionate declarations. Only after she'd given him everything, her trust, her heart, her innocence, did she discover the truth. Their engagement had been nothing but a scheme to gain access to her father's business records. When her father's company collapsed under mysterious circumstances, and Charles announced their engagement was over, the scandal had been devastating. Her father's subsequent heart attack left Grace alone, penniless, and branded by Philadelphia society as damaged goods. No, she decided, turning over in bed. Mrs. Holloway was wrong. Men like Charles or like the quietly confident Lucas Young were cut from the same cloth. They took what they wanted and discarded what no longer served their purposes. Yet when she finally drifted off to sleep, it was those clear blue eyes, not Charles's dark ones, that followed her into her dreams. Saturday dawned bright and clear, the spring air carrying a hint of warmth that promised summer wasn't far away. Despite her resolution to stay home that evening, Grace found herself paying extra attention to her appearance as she dressed for the day. She told herself it was simply pride, not any consideration of possibly attending the social. The morning passed in a flurry of customers, many stocking up on supplies before closing for the afternoon festivities. Just before noon, the bell above the door jingled, and Grace looked up to see Lucas Young entering the store. Today, he wore a clean shirt under his leather vest, and his dark hair was neatly combed beneath his hat. The sight of him sent an unexpected jolt through her. "Miss Cooper," he greeted her with a slight tip of his hat. "Mrs. Holloway around. She's gone to help with preparations for the social," Grace replied, keeping her voice even. "Can I assist you with something?" Lucas approached the counter, reaching into his vest pocket to extract a small piece of paper. "Need a few things from this list if you don't mind." Grace took the paper, careful not to let their fingers touch. The list was written in a surprisingly neat hand: coffee, sugar, salt, matches, lamp oil, basic supplies for a ranch, of course. She began gathering the items, aware of his gaze following her movements. "Will this be all, Mr. Young, Lucas?" he corrected gently. "And yes, unless you've reconsidered about tonight." Grace stilled, a tin of coffee in her hand. "I have not," Lucas nodded, showing no sign of disappointment. "Fair enough. Just thought I'd ask." As she tallied his purchases, Grace found herself speaking before she could reconsider. "Why do you keep asking? There are plenty of young women in town who would be delighted by your attention." Something flickered in those blue eyes, amusement, perhaps, or something deeper. "Maybe I'm not interested in just any young woman." Grace felt heat rising to her cheeks. "You don't know anything about me." "I know you're brave," he said simply. "Coming all this way alone, starting over, that takes courage." "It wasn't courage, it was necessity." She wrapped his purchases in brown paper with more force than necessary. Sometimes they're the same thing. Lucas placed money on the counter. "If you change your mind, the social starts at 6, Town Square." He gathered his supplies and turned to leave, but paused at the door. "Oh, and Miss Cooper, blue suits you, brings out your eyes." With that, he was gone, leaving Grace staring after him, one hand unconsciously touching the collar of her blue work dress. By 5:30 that evening, Grace was pacing her small room, torn between staying safely within its confines and venturing out to the social. Mrs. Holloway had left hours ago to help with the preparations, leaving Grace truly alone with her thoughts for the first time in days. "This is ridiculous," she muttered to herself. "It's just a town gathering. It doesn't mean anything." And yet, as she stood before the small mirror above her washbasin, she found herself reaching for the one good dress she'd brought from Philadelphia, a deep green cotton that she'd carefully preserved, despite its growing outdatedness by Eastern standards. Before she could talk herself out of it, Grace quickly changed, pinning her hair in a simpler style than she'd worn in Philadelphia, but more elegant than her usual severe bun. No cosmetics. Of course those were luxuries long abandoned, but she pinched her cheeks for color and bit her lips to redden them slightly. The sun was beginning its descent as she stepped onto Oklahoma City's Main Street. Music and laughter already drifted from the town square, where lanterns had been strung between newly planted trees. Tables laden with food lined one side of the square, while a small group of musicians, 2 fiddlers, a banjo player, and an elderly man with a harmonica provided lively tunes from a makeshift platform. Grace hesitated at the edge of the gathering, suddenly feeling exposed. Perhaps this had been a mistake after all. She was about to turn back when Mrs. Holloway spotted her. "Grace, you came." The older woman hurried over, her round face flushed with pleasure. "And wearing your pretty dress too. Come, you must try some of Mrs. Peterson's apple pie before it's all gone." Before Grace could protest, she found herself being led into the heart of the social, introduced to what seemed like half the town in quick succession. Everyone was welcoming, if curious about the reserved young woman who'd kept to herself since arriving. "Is that Miss Cooper I see?" Sheriff Tanner approached, his usually stern face relaxed in the festive atmosphere. "Beginning to think you were a ghost, the way you haunt that store without ever setting foot elsewhere." "Sheriff," Grace acknowledged with a polite nod, "I've been focused on my work." "All work and no play makes for a dull life," he replied with a wink. "Good to see you joining in. This town needs more respectable young ladies." Grace tensed at the word respectable, wondering what any of them would think if they knew her history. The scandal would have followed her even here, if anyone from Philadelphia had recognized her. She'd been careful to change her surname, using her mother's maiden name instead of her father's once respected one. As the evening progressed, Grace found herself gradually relaxing. The simple pleasure of good food and friendly conversation began to work its magic, reminding her of what she'd been missing in her self-imposed isolation. Still, she couldn't help scanning the gathering, searching for a certain tall figure with sky-blue eyes. "He's not here yet, Mrs. Holloway said beside her, a knowing smile on her face. "Lucas always comes late to these things, has to make sure the ranch is settled for the night before he leaves." Grace flushed. "I wasn't, of course you weren't, dear." Mrs. Holloway patted her arm. "Now come help me serve the lemonade. The dancing will start soon, and everyone will be thirsty." For the next half hour, Grace busied herself with practical tasks, trying to ignore the increasing flutter of anticipation in her stomach. The sun had fully set, and the lanterns cast a warm, golden glow over the square when the musicians struck up a lively reel. Couples quickly formed on the open area that served as a dance floor. "May I have this dance, Miss Cooper?" The voice came from behind her, but it wasn't the one she'd been unconsciously waiting for. Grace turned to find a smartly dressed man in his 30s smiling at her. She recognized him as Mr. Barrett, the town banker. "I'm afraid I don't dance, Mr. Barrett, but thank you for asking." His smile faltered slightly. "Surely just one dance wouldn't," the lady said. "No, Barrett." The deep voice cut through their conversation like a knife through butter. Lucas Young stood just a few feet away, his expression neutral but his eyes hard as they fixed on the banker. Barrett's face reddened. "No harm in asking, Young, just being friendly to newcomers." "Of course." Lucas's tone remained level, but something in his stance made the banker take a step back. "Another time, perhaps, Miss Cooper." With a curt nod, Barrett retreated toward a group of businessmen near the lemonade table. Grace turned to Lucas, torn between irritation at his interference and relief at his arrival. "I'm perfectly capable of declining an invitation without your help, Mr. Young." The corner of his mouth quirked upward. "So I noticed, but Barrett doesn't always take no for an answer. Figured I'd save you both some trouble." He studied her for a moment, his expression softening. "You look beautiful tonight, Miss Cooper." The simple compliment delivered without artifice caught Grace off guard. "Thank you," she managed, suddenly flustered. "You're late." "Had a foaling mare that needed watching. Just got her settled with a healthy colt before I rode in." His eyes never left her face, as though memorizing every feature. "I'm glad you came." "I almost didn't," she admitted. "What changed your mind?" Grace hesitated, unwilling to admit that he had played any part in her decision. "Mrs. Holloway can be quite persuasive." Lucas chuckled, a warm, rich sound that sent an unexpected shiver down her spine. "That she can." The music changed to a slower waltz and he tilted his head slightly. "Would you dance with me, Grace?" The use of her first name should have felt presumptuous, but somehow it didn't. Still, old fears died hard. "I don't think that would be wise." "Probably not," he agreed, surprising her. "But sometimes the wisest choice isn't the right one." He extended his hand, calloused and strong. "Just one dance, then I'll leave you be if that's what you want." Perhaps it was the gentle understanding in his eyes, or simply the magnetic pull she'd felt since first seeing him, but Grace found herself placing her hand in his. His fingers closed around hers carefully, as though she were something precious and easily broken. Lucas led her to the edge of the dancing area, turning to face her with quiet confidence. His right hand settled respectfully at her waist while his left continued to hold her hand. The contact was minimal, proper, yet Grace felt it like a brand through the fabric of her dress. "It's been a while since I've done this," she confessed as they began to move to the music. "You're doing fine." His smile was gentle. "Just follow my lead." And somehow she did. Despite his size and the roughness of his appearance, Lucas moved with surprising grace. He guided her skillfully through the steps, maintaining a respectful distance while creating a sense of intimacy that made Grace's heart race. "Where did a ranch hand learn to waltz?" she asked, trying to distract herself from the warmth spreading through her. I wasn't always a rancher, he replied, smoothly turning her to avoid another couple. My father owned a shipping company in New Orleans. Dancing was part of doing business in those circles. Grace looked up at him in surprise. What brought you here then, so far from home? Something shadowed his eyes. The war changed everything. After Shiloh, I couldn't go back to that life. He didn't elaborate, but the brief mention of one of the Civil War's bloodiest battles told Grace enough. Though he couldn't be much over 30, Lucas Young had seen horrors she could only imagine. I'm sorry, she said softly. Don't be. Found my place here. His hand tightened slightly on hers. Sometimes losing everything is the only way to find what you really need. The words struck a chord deep within her. Wasn't that exactly what had happened to her? Losing her father, her home, her place in society, all of it had driven her to this frontier town, to a new life that, while harder in many ways, offered a freedom she'd never known in Philadelphia. As the music ended, Lucas didn't immediately release her. For a breathless moment, they stood connected by joined hands and shared gazes, something unspoken passing between them. Thank you for the dance, Mr. Young, Grace finally said, gently withdrawing her hand. Lucas, he corrected again, his voice low, and thank you, Grace, for taking a chance. She understood he meant more than just the dance. Before she could respond, Mrs. Holloway appeared at her elbow, face flushed with excitement. There you are, dear. Pastor Williams is about to announce the raffle results. Lucas, good to see you made it after all. The spell broken, Grace stepped back, suddenly aware of the curious glances being cast their way. In a town this size, dancing with the same partner, especially one as notable as Lucas Young, was tantamount to a public declaration of interest. I should help with the serving, Grace murmured, using the excuse to retreat from both Lucas's penetrating gaze and the speculative looks of the townspeople. For the remainder of the evening, Grace kept herself busy with practical tasks, though she remained acutely aware of Lucas's presence. He didn't seek her out again, respecting the boundary she'd re-established, but occasionally she would look up to find those blue eyes watching her from across the square, his expression thoughtful. As the gathering began to disperse, Grace found herself both relieved and disappointed that their interaction had ended with that single dance. It was for the best, she told herself firmly. Getting involved with any man, especially one who affected her as strongly as Lucas Young, was a risk she couldn't afford to take. Yet as she walked back to the general store with Mrs. Holloway, listening to the older woman's enthusiastic recounting of the evening's events, Grace couldn't help but feel that something had shifted inside her. A door she'd thought permanently closed had been nudged slightly ajar, letting in a dangerous sliver of light. Over the next 2 weeks, Lucas Young became a more frequent visitor to the general store. Sometimes he came with legitimate purchases to make, other times his excuses were transparently flimsy. Grace maintained her professional demeanor, but found it increasingly difficult to keep her guard up against his quiet persistence. Unlike Charles, with his flowery compliments and grand gestures, Lucas's approach was straightforward. He asked about her day, listened attentively to her answers, and occasionally shared small details about his own life. He never pressed when she deflected personal questions, seeming content to earn her trust gradually. You should see his ranch, Mrs. Holloway told Grace one evening as they inventoried a new shipment. Started with barely 20 acres and a ramshackle cabin. Now he's got over 200 acres of good grazing land and a proper house he built himself. You seem quite taken with Mr. Young, Grace observed, trying to keep her tone neutral. Mrs. Holloway chuckled. Hard not to be. Man who builds something from nothing commands respect. She gave Grace a sidelong glance. And he's not hard on the eyes either for those who notice such things. Grace determinedly focused on counting coffee tins. I'm sure many women in town have noticed. Oh, they've noticed all right. Lorna Peterson's been throwing her daughter at him for 2 years now. Amanda Jenkins bakes him a pie every Sunday. The older woman sorted through a box of fabric bolts. Never shown interest in any of them, though. Not until you came along. Mrs. Holloway, Grace protested, her cheeks warming. Mr. Young and I have a perfectly ordinary customer-shopkeeper relationship. Hum. That's why he rides 10 miles into town 3 times a week when he used to come in once a month. Mrs. Holloway's eyes twinkled. Must really need a lot of sugar and coffee these days. Before Grace could formulate a response, the door opened, admitting Sheriff Tanner. His expression was grimmer than usual as he approached the counter. Evening, ladies. Miss Cooper, mind if I have a word? A cold dread settled in Grace's stomach. Of course, Sheriff. Had someone from Philadelphia recognized her after all? Was her carefully constructed new life about to crumble? Got a telegram today from Philadelphia. The sheriff watched her carefully as he spoke. Man named Blackstone's been asking after a Miss Grace Calloway, says she's his fiancé, disappeared with family valuables. Grace felt the blood drain from her face. Charles was looking for her. And he was accusing her of theft to justify his search. The irony would have been laughable if it weren't so terrifying. I don't know any Grace Calloway, she managed, hating the tremor in her voice. Sheriff Tanner's eyes narrowed slightly. Funny thing is, description matches you pretty close. Blonde hair, green eyes, about your height and age. He paused. And Cooper was listed as her mother's maiden name. Mrs. Holloway stepped closer to Grace, her presence supportive. Sheriff, what exactly are you suggesting? Not suggesting anything yet, Mrs. Holloway, just making inquiries. His gaze remained fixed on Grace. But I'd appreciate some straight answers, Miss Cooper. Or is it Miss Calloway? Grace's mind raced. There was no use denying it, the connection was too clear. But if she admitted the truth, would they believe her version over Charles's? A woman alone, with no references or connections, against the word of a respected Philadelphia businessman. Sheriff, she began, only to be interrupted by the door opening once more. Lucas Young entered, removing his hat as he crossed the threshold. His gaze took in the tableau before him, the sheriff's stern expression, Mrs. Holloway's protective stance, and Grace's evident distress. Evening, Tanner, he said calmly, moving to stand beside Grace. Something wrong. Private discussion, Young, the sheriff replied. Best wait outside. Actually, Lucas said, his voice quiet but firm, I think I'll stay. Seems Miss Cooper might need a friend right now. The simple declaration, delivered without drama but with absolute certainty, nearly undid Grace. She hadn't had anyone truly in her corner since her father died. The realization that Lucas was offering her not just his presence but his support brought a lump to her throat. Sheriff Tanner sighed. Fine. Miss Cooper here needs to explain why a man in Philadelphia is claiming she's his runaway fiancé who stole family heirlooms. Lucas didn't look at Grace, keeping his attention on the sheriff. That true, Tanner, or is it just what this man claims? Just what he claims for now. That's why I'm asking, Lucas nodded. And who is this man? Name's Charles Blackstone, says he's a businessman from a respected family. Something flickered in Lucas's eyes. Blackstone, he turned to Grace. Any relation to Edward Blackstone of Blackstone Shipping? Grace stared at him in shock. His son, you know of him, not personally, but my father did business with Edward Blackstone before the war. His expression darkened. Never trusted him. Said he had a habit of ruining his competitors through questionable means. Sheriff Tanner frowned. That may be, but it doesn't explain why his son is looking for Miss Cooper here, or why she's using a different name. Grace took a deep breath, drawing strength from Lucas's steady presence. My name was Grace Calloway. I changed it to Cooper, my mother's maiden name, when I came west. She straightened her shoulders. I was engaged to Charles Blackstone, yes, but I didn't steal anything from him or his family. Then why run? The sheriff asked, though his tone had softened slightly. Because he ruined my father. The words came out bitter and harsh. Charles courted me to gain access to my father's business records. He used that information to orchestrate my father's financial ruin. When the company collapsed, he broke our engagement, claiming he couldn't marry into a disgraced family. Her voice threatened to break. My father had a heart attack 2 days later. He died leaving nothing but debts, and Charles had the audacity to suggest that if I wanted to make amends for my father's failures, he could arrange a position for me as his mistress, not his wife. Mrs. Holloway gasped. Lucas's jaw tightened, his eyes hardening to chips of blue ice. I took nothing but what was rightfully mine, my mother's jewelry and my own personal possessions, Grace continued. I sold what I had to and used the money to come west, to start over where no one knew me or my shame. The sheriff studied her for a long moment. That's quite a story, Miss Cooper or Calloway. It's the truth, she said firmly. I have no way to prove it, but it's the truth. Lucas spoke up. I believe her, Sheriff. Tanner raised an eyebrow. Based on what exactly? Based on what I know of the Blackstone family reputation. Based on the fact that Miss Cooper has been nothing but honest and hardworking since she arrived in Oklahoma City. Lucas's voice remained level, but there was steel beneath it. And based on the simple fact that if she were truly a thief running from justice, she'd have chosen somewhere more anonymous than a frontier town where everyone notices newcomers. The sheriff considered this, then slowly nodded. Fair points. He turned back to Grace. I'll need to send some response to this telegram. Tell him you've made inquiries and found no one matching that description, Lucas suggested. No need to confirm or deny she was ever here. Tanner nodded thoughtfully. Could do that, for now anyway. He gave Grace a level look. But if there's anything else I should know, anything that might come back on this town, you'd best tell me now. There's nothing else, Sheriff, Grace assured him. I just want to live my life in peace. After the sheriff left, promising to be discreet for the time being, an awkward silence fell over the store. Mrs. Holloway, showing unusual tact, murmured something about checking the back storeroom and disappeared, leaving Grace alone with Lucas. Thank you, she said quietly, not quite able to meet his eyes. You didn't have to do that. Yes, I did. His voice was gentle but firm. Man who'd treat a woman that way deserves no loyalty or protection. Grace finally looked up at him, searching his face for any sign of judgment or disgust. She found only warm concern and something deeper she couldn't quite name. You must think me a fool, she said bitterly, to be so thoroughly deceived. Lucas shook his head. I think you trusted someone who presented himself as trustworthy. That doesn't make you a fool, Grace. It makes him a liar. The simple absolution, offered without reservation, broke something inside her. To her horror, Grace felt tears welling in her eyes. She turned away quickly, unwilling to let him see her cry, but a gentle hand on her shoulder stopped her. You don't have to hide from me, Lucas said softly. Not your tears, not your past. None of it changes how I see you. She turned back slowly, forcing herself to meet his gaze. And how do you see me, Mr. Young? His eyes held her steadily. I see a woman of remarkable courage and dignity. Someone who faced betrayal and loss but refused to be broken by it. His voice dropped lower. I see someone worth knowing, Grace, someone worth caring about. The words hung between them, honest and unadorned. No flowery declarations or grand promises, just a simple truth that resonated more deeply than any of Charles's elaborate compliments ever had. Before Grace could respond, Mrs. Holloway bustled back in, breaking the moment. Lucas stepped back, replacing his hat. I should get back to the ranch, he said. Getting dark soon. Grace nodded, suddenly uncertain. Thank you again, Lucas. The use of his first name brought a small smile to his face. Anytime, Grace. He paused at the door. I'll be back tomorrow. That fence in the north pasture still needs work. It was a flimsy excuse, given how often he'd fixed that particular fence in recent weeks, but Grace found herself smiling. We'll have those fence posts ready. After he left, Mrs. Holloway gave Grace a searching look. You all right, child? I think I might be, Grace replied honestly. Someday. Lucas Young's a good man, the older woman said. Not like your Charles Blackstone, Grace sighed. I'm not sure I can trust my judgment anymore, Mrs. Holloway. Then trust mine, the widow replied firmly. Been watching people for 70 years. I know the real thing when I see it. She patted Grace's hand. "Just don't wait too long to figure it out yourself. Good men like that don't come along often, especially out here." That night, Grace lay awake long after she should have been sleeping, replaying the events of the day. The fear when Sheriff Tanner had mentioned Charles's telegram. The solid, reassuring presence of Lucas as he stood beside her. The way he'd believed her story without question or doubt. It was dangerous, this warming of her heart toward him. And yet, for the first time since arriving in Oklahoma City, Grace found herself considering a future that included more than just survival. The following weeks brought a subtle shift in Grace's relationship with Lucas. Though neither of them spoke directly of feelings or intentions, there was a new ease between them, a tentative trust beginning to bloom. Lucas continued his frequent visits to the general store, sometimes staying to share a cup of coffee and conversation after making his purchases. Grace learned that he had fought for the Confederacy not out of political conviction, but because his home and family were in New Orleans. He'd been wounded at Shiloh and captured by Union forces. After the war, he'd found his family's business in ruins and his parents dead from yellow fever. With nothing left to hold him, he'd headed west to start anew. "We have that in common," Grace observed one quiet afternoon as they sat on the store's small back porch. "Both refugees from our former lives." Lucas nodded, his fingers curled around his coffee mug. "Difference is I chose to leave everything behind. You were forced to." "Perhaps," Grace said thoughtfully, "but I'm not sure I would have found the courage to break free otherwise. Sometimes I think Charles did me a favor in a twisted way. If he hadn't shown his true nature, I might have married him and spent my life tied to a man incapable of true feeling." Lucas studied her for a moment. "You ever miss it? The life you had back east?" Grace considered the question honestly. "I miss certain comforts, hot baths whenever I wanted. Books, music," she smiled slightly. "Not having to worry about scorpions in my shoes in the morning." That earned a chuckle from Lucas. "Fair enough. But the constraints of that life, the endless social obligations, the rigid expectations, I don't miss those at all." She looked out across the dusty yard behind the store to where the prairie stretched toward the horizon. "There's a freedom here I never knew in Philadelphia. Despite everything, I wouldn't go back." Lucas nodded, understanding in his eyes. "Frontier changes people, strips away pretense. Out here, you're judged by what you can do, not who your family is or how much money you have." "Is that why you stayed?" Grace asked. "After the war, partly." He set his coffee mug down. "Also needed space to figure out who I was after everything I'd seen, what kind of man I wanted to be." His gaze turned distant. "Killing changes you, makes you question everything you thought you knew about yourself." Grace reached out impulsively, placing her hand over his. It was the first time she'd initiated contact between them, and the significance wasn't lost on either of them. Lucas turned his hand to gently clasp hers, his calloused thumb brushing across her knuckles. "You're a good man, Lucas Young," she said softly. "Whatever you had to do during the war doesn't change that." He looked at their joined hands, then up to her face. "Been telling myself that for years. First time I've actually believed it was hearing you say it just now." The moment stretched between them, intimate and fragile. Grace knew she should withdraw her hand, maintain the careful distance she'd established with every man since Charles. But she couldn't bring herself to break the connection. The spell was broken by Mrs. Holloway's voice calling from inside the store. "Grace, we've got customers." Reluctantly, Grace pulled her hand away. "I should go." Lucas nodded, standing as she did. "Would you? Would you have dinner with me tomorrow, at my ranch?" The invitation surprised her. It was the first time he'd suggested she come to his home, and the implications weren't lost on her. In frontier society, such a visit would be considered highly improper without a chaperone. Lucas seemed to read her hesitation. "Mrs. Holloway would be welcome to join us, of course, and my foreman and his wife live on the property. Nothing improper intended." Grace found herself smiling at his consideration. "I'd like that, Lucas, though I'm not sure Mrs. Holloway could manage the ride." "I'll bring my wagon," he offered. "More comfortable for both of you." That settled, Lucas left with a tip of his hat and a smile that stayed with Grace for the rest of the day. The following afternoon found Grace nervously preparing for the dinner at Lucas's ranch. She wore her green dress again, the only one she owned nice enough for a social occasion, and allowed herself the luxury of arranging her hair in a softer style than her usual severe bun. "You look lovely, dear," Mrs. Holloway approved as they waited for Lucas to arrive with his wagon. The older woman was dressed in her Sunday best, clearly taking her role as chaperone seriously. Like a proper young lady should. "I'm hardly a young lady anymore," Grace demurred. At 26, she was well past the age when most frontier women were married with several children, Mrs. Holloway snorted. "Nonsense. You're in your prime, and Lucas Young knows it too if the way he looks at you is any indication." Before Grace could respond to that startling observation, the sound of wagon wheels announced Lucas's arrival. He helped them both up onto the wooden bench seat, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary at Grace's waist as he lifted her. The ride to the Broken Arrow Ranch took nearly an hour, giving Grace ample time to observe the changing landscape as they left Oklahoma City behind. The prairie stretched around them, vast and golden in the late afternoon sun, dotted with stands of cottonwood trees along the creek beds. "It's beautiful," she murmured as they crested a small rise, revealing a vista of rolling grassland. "So open." Lucas smiled, clearly pleased by her appreciation. "First time I saw this land, knew I wanted to put down roots here. Something about the space of it speaks to the soul." As they approached the ranch, Grace could see why Mrs. Holloway had spoken so admiringly of what Lucas had built. A solid two-story house of hewn logs stood on a gentle slope, flanked by several well-constructed outbuildings. A corral held several horses, and in the distance, cattle grazed in fenced pastures that stretched toward the horizon. "You built all this yourself?" she asked, genuinely impressed. Lucas nodded. "Had help with the barn raising and such, but the house I did mostly alone." There was quiet pride in his voice. "Took 3 years to get it just how I wanted it." "It's wonderful," Grace said sincerely. The house wasn't grand by Eastern standards, but its sturdy construction and thoughtful design spoke of care and attention to detail. As Lucas helped them down from the wagon, the front door opened to reveal a stout woman with silver-streaked dark hair and a weathered, friendly face. "About time you got here," she called. "Biscuits are getting cold." Lucas grinned. "Mrs. Cooper, Mrs. Holloway, this is Margaret Wilson, my foreman's wife and the best cook in Oklahoma Territory. Margaret, these are our guests from town." Margaret wiped her hands on her apron and came forward to greet them warmly. "Been waiting to meet you, Miss Cooper. This one won't stop talking about the pretty shopkeeper in town." She jerked her thumb toward Lucas, who actually blushed slightly. "Margaret," he protested, but the older woman just laughed. "Oh, hush, cat's out of the bag now, might as well be honest about it." She ushered them toward the house. Come in, come in. Jim's already at the table, no doubt sneaking bites when he thinks I'm not looking." The interior of the house was surprisingly comfortable. The main room combined living and dining areas, with a large stone fireplace at one end and a sturdy wooden table at the other. Simple but well-crafted furniture filled the space, and curtains at the windows softened the rustic feel. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes that made Grace's heart leap with pleasure. "You have books," she said, unable to keep the delight from her voice. Lucas smiled. "Can't claim to have read them all, but I try. Feel free to borrow any that interest you." A gray-haired man with a weathered face rose from the table as they entered. "Jim Wilson," he introduced himself with a firm handshake. "Foreman here at Broken Arrow. Pleased to meet you ladies." Dinner was a surprisingly elegant affair given the frontier setting. Margaret had prepared a feast of roast beef, potatoes, fresh vegetables from her garden, and the promised biscuits, which were indeed exceptional. The conversation flowed easily, with the Wilsons sharing amusing stories about ranch life and early days in the territory. "You should have seen this place when Lucas first bought it," Jim said, gesturing with his fork. Nothing but a tumble-down shack and overgrazed pasture. Previous owner nearly drank himself to death after losing most of his herd in the winter of '84. Jim exaggerates, Lucas said modestly. The land was good, just needed proper management. And a man willing to work from sunrise to sunset for 3 years straight, Margaret added. Never seen anyone so determined. Grace found herself watching Lucas throughout the meal, seeing him in a new light. Here in his own home, surrounded by people who clearly respected him, he seemed more settled, more complete somehow. This was his kingdom, built by his own hands through sheer determination and hard work. After dinner, Lucas suggested a short walk to see the sunset from a ridge behind the house. Mrs. Holloway, claiming fatigue from the journey, elected to stay behind with Margaret, giving Grace a significant look that made it clear the older woman was deliberately providing an opportunity for privacy. As they walked side by side through the golden evening light, Grace felt a strange mixture of nervousness and anticipation. There was something building between them, something that both thrilled and terrified her. "Thank you for coming today," Lucas said as they reached the ridge. Below them, the ranch buildings looked small against the vast expanse of prairie. In the distance, the sun was beginning its descent, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. "Thank you for inviting us," Grace replied. "Your home is lovely, Lucas. Built it thinking of a family someday." He glanced at her, then back at the horizon. "Hard to find women willing to take on ranch life, though. It's not easy." "I can imagine," Grace said softly. "The isolation alone would be challenging." Lucas nodded. "That's why I go to town so often, truth be told. Gets lonely out here sometimes." The admission, simple and honest, touched her deeply. "Is that the only reason you come to town so frequently?" she asked, finding courage she didn't know she possessed. Lucas turned to face her fully, the setting sun gilding his features. "You know it's not." His voice was gentle but direct. "Been coming to see you, Grace. Think you've known that for a while now." She had known, of course, but hearing him say it aloud made her heart race. "Why me, Lucas? There are plenty of women in town who would be delighted by your attention, women without complications in their past." "Don't want them." His blue eyes held her steadily. "Want you." The simple declaration, delivered without artifice, left her breathless. "You don't know me," she protested weakly. "Know enough," he countered. "Know you're brave and proud and stronger than you think. Know you make me want to be better than I am." He took a step closer, not touching her but close enough that she could feel the warmth radiating from him. "Know I've thought about you every day since we met." Grace swallowed hard, fighting the urge to flee from the intensity of the moment. "I've been hurt before, Lucas, badly. I don't know if I can trust again, if I even remember how." "I'm not asking for promises, Grace, just a chance." His voice softened. "Let me show you that not every man is like Charles Blackstone, that some of us mean what we say and say what we mean." The sincerity in his eyes was her undoing. Before she could reconsider, Grace closed the small distance between them, reaching up to touch his face. The gesture was tentative, exploratory, her fingers brushing against his bearded jaw with wonder. Lucas remained perfectly still, allowing her to set the pace of this new intimacy. His eyes never left hers, and in them she saw a patience and understanding that Charles had never possessed. "I'm afraid," she whispered, the admission costing her pride but necessary for honesty. "So am I," he replied, surprising her. "Afraid of not being worthy of your trust, afraid of failing you." His hand came up slowly to cover hers where it rested against his cheek. "But some things are worth being afraid for, Grace." The truth of his words resonated within her. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, Lucas leaned down. His lips met hers in a kiss so gentle it brought tears to her eyes. There was no demand in it, no possession, just a tender question, an offering of what could be. When they parted, Grace found herself trembling slightly, overwhelmed by the emotions coursing through her. "Lucas, he shook his head slightly. "Don't need to say anything now. We've got time, Grace, all the time you need." As they walked back to the house hand in hand, the setting sun casting long shadows across the grassland, Grace felt something shift inside her. The walls she'd built around her heart weren't gone, but for the first time since Charles's betrayal, she could imagine letting someone pass them again. It terrified her, and yet, with Lucas's strong hand holding hers, it also felt like coming home. The following weeks brought a gradual deepening of their relationship. Lucas continued to court her with a patient steadiness that spoke more eloquently than words. There were more dinners at his ranch, picnics by the creek that ran through his property, and quiet conversations on the store's back porch after closing. Grace found herself opening up to him about her past, the privileged upbringing in Philadelphia society, her father's proud refusal to accept help when his business began to fail, and the devastating aftermath of Charles's betrayal. Lucas listened without judgment, offering comfort through his steady presence rather than empty platitudes. In turn, he shared more of his own history, the horrors he'd witnessed during the war, his struggle to find purpose afterward, and his journey west in search of redemption. He spoke of the nightmares that still sometimes plagued him, and the peace he'd finally found in the rhythm of ranch life. "You never married?" Grace asked one evening as they sat on the ridge watching the sunset, a ritual they'd established during her visits to the ranch. Lucas shook his head. "Came close once, about 5 years ago. Sarah Jenkins, she teaches at the school now. We courted for nearly a year." Grace tried to ignore the twinge of jealousy the information provoked. "What happened?" "Realized I didn't love her the way she deserved," he said simply. "Wouldn't have been fair to either of us to go through with it." "That was honorable of you," Grace said softly. Lucas shrugged. "Saw too many loveless marriages growing up in New Orleans society. Promised myself I'd never settle for that kind of emptiness." He glanced at her. "What about you?" "Before Charles, I mean," Grace smiled ruefully. "There were suitors, of course, but none that interested me until Charles." She plucked a stem of prairie grass, twirling it between her fingers. "I thought he was different from the others, more genuine, less concerned with social position." A bitter laugh escaped her. "I was spectacularly wrong." Lucas's hand found hers, his touch warm and reassuring. "He was a fool, Grace, a damn fool to throw away what he had with you." The conviction in his voice warmed her. "Thank you for saying that. Not just saying it, mean it." His thumb traced gentle circles on her palm. "Man who'd use a woman the way he used you doesn't deserve a second thought, let alone your continued pain." Grace turned to look at him, struck once again by the quiet intensity that seemed to emanate from him. "How did you get to be so wise, Lucas Young?" A ghost of a smile touched his lips. "Not wisdom, just plain sense." He hesitated, then added, "And maybe knowing what it's like to lose everything makes a man appreciate true value when he sees it." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Grace felt her heart quicken as Lucas leaned closer, his intention clear in his eyes. Their lips met in a kiss deeper than their first, charged with growing emotion and trust. As they drew apart, Lucas kept her close, his forehead resting against hers. "I'm falling in love with you, Grace Cooper," he murmured, the words barely audible above the evening breeze. "Think maybe I have been since that first day in the store." The declaration should have frightened her, but instead, Grace felt a surge of warmth spreading through her chest. "I don't know if I'm ready to say those words yet," she admitted honestly, "but I'm finding that I want to be." Lucas smiled, the expression lighting his eyes. "That's enough for now." The peaceful interlude was shattered 3 days later when Sheriff Tanner arrived at the general store with a grim expression. "Miss Cooper," he said, hat in hand. "Afraid I've got some news you won't like." Grace set down the inventory ledger she'd been working on, dread pooling in her stomach. "What is it, Sheriff?" got word from the marshal in Wichita. Man matching Charles Blackstone's description was asking questions there about a blonde woman traveling west after the land run. Tanner's face was sympathetic but serious. "Sounds like he's tracking you, madam." Grace gripped the edge of the counter, feeling the blood drain from her face. Did he say where he was headed next?" Marshall didn't say. "But if he's following your trail, won't take him long to reach Oklahoma City." Mrs. Holloway moved to stand beside Grace, her presence steadying. "What can we do, Sheriff? Grace hasn't done anything wrong," Tanner sighed. "That might be true, madam, but without evidence, it's her word against his, and a man with money and connections usually has the advantage in such situations. Can't you refuse to help him?" Grace asked, fighting to keep her voice steady. "If he has legal papers, a warrant maybe, for theft, I'd be obliged to cooperate." The sheriff shifted uncomfortably. "Though I might be able to delay things, give you some time." "Time for what? To run again?" Grace shook her head, sudden anger replacing her fear. "No, I've been running for months. I won't do it anymore. This is my home now." The bell above the door jingled and Lucas entered, stopping short at the tableau before him. His gaze took in the sheriff's somber expression and Grace's pale face, and his own expression hardened. "What's happened?" he demanded, crossing to stand at Grace's side. Sheriff Tanner explained the situation briefly. As he listened, Lucas's jaw tightened, but his voice remained level when he spoke. "When was Blackstone in Wichita?" 3 days ago, according to the telegram." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "That means he could be here by tomorrow if he's traveling by stage." The reality of the situation hit Grace with full force. Tomorrow. Charles could be here tomorrow, bringing with him all the shame and pain she'd fled. She'd have to face him, possibly be accused publicly of theft, maybe even be arrested. The sanctuary she'd found in Oklahoma City would be destroyed. "What are you thinking, Lucas?" Sheriff Tanner asked, his gaze shrewd. "Thinking Grace needs a lawyer, for one thing." Lucas's hand found hers, squeezing gently. "And thinking there might be another way to handle this that doesn't involve her running or being at Blackstone's mercy." "What way?" Grace asked, clinging to the hope in his voice. Lucas looked down at her, his blue eyes intense. "Marry me." The proposal, blunt and unexpected, left Grace speechless. Mrs. Holloway gasped softly beside her. "Lucas, you can't," Grace began, only to be cut off. "I can and I am." His voice was steady, his grip on her hand firm. "As your husband, I'd have legal standing to protect you. Your property would become mine in the eyes of the law, making any claim of theft much harder to pursue." "But that's not a reason to get married," Grace protested, though her heart had leapt at his words. "It's one reason," Lucas agreed, "but not the only one." His voice softened. "Been planning to ask you properly, had it all worked out. Dinner at the ranch, sunset on the ridge." "Ring in my pocket." A rueful smile touched his lips. "This isn't how I wanted to do it, but the feeling behind it is the same." He took both her hands in his. "I love you, Grace. Want to build a life with you. The fact that marrying me might also solve this problem with Blackstone is just convenient timing." Sheriff Tanner cleared his throat. "He's right about the legal aspect, Miss Cooper. Married woman's property belongs to her husband. Blackstone would have to bring his complaint against Lucas, not you." "And I'd like to see him try," Lucas added, a dangerous glint in his eyes. Grace's mind whirled with the implications. Marriage, to Lucas. The idea both thrilled and terrified her. She'd known him barely 2 months. Was that enough time to make such a momentous decision? And yet, she couldn't deny the feelings that had grown between them or the sense of rightness she felt in his presence. "This is very sudden," she managed, needing time to process. Lucas nodded. "I know, and if there was more time, I'd court you proper, give you as long as you needed to be sure." His expression grew serious. "But there isn't time, Grace. If Blackstone arrives tomorrow, you need the protection of my name today." "The judge is in town," Sheriff Tanner offered. "Could perform the ceremony this afternoon if you're agreeable, Mrs." Holloway, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. "Grace, child, I've lived a long time and seen many marriages, some for love, some for convenience, some for both." She patted Grace's arm gently. "This man loves you. Anyone with eyes can see that. And you care for him too, whether you're ready to admit it fully or not." Grace looked from Mrs. Holloway to the sheriff, and finally to Lucas, whose blue eyes held her steadily, filled with both love and resolve. "If we do this," she said slowly, "I need to know it's real. Not just a legal maneuver to thwart Charles." "It's real," Lucas said firmly. "Been real since the moment I saw you." Grace took a deep breath, her decision crystallizing. Then yes, I'll marry you, Lucas Young. The ceremony took place that afternoon in Judge Williams's parlor, with Sheriff Tanner and Mrs. Holloway as witnesses. Grace wore her green dress, hastily pressed for the occasion, and carried a small bouquet of wildflowers that Lucas had gathered on his way into town. Despite the rushed arrangements, there was a solemnity to the proceedings that touched Grace deeply. "Do you, Lucas James Young, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" Judge Williams intoned, his weathered face serious beneath bushy white eyebrows. "I do." Lucas's voice was clear and certain, his eyes never leaving Grace's face. "And do you, Grace Elizabeth Cooper, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Grace hesitated only a moment, searching Lucas's face one last time. What she saw there, love, commitment, steadfast determination, gave her the courage to answer. "I do. Then by the authority vested in me by the territory of Oklahoma, I pronounce you husband and wife." The judge closed his Bible with a satisfied nod. "You may kiss your bride, Mr. Young." Lucas's kiss was gentle but possessive, a silent promise of both protection and passion. When they parted, Grace was surprised to find tears in her eyes. "Mrs. Young," Lucas murmured, the name sounding right on his lips. After signing the marriage certificate and accepting congratulations from their small group of witnesses, Lucas turned to Grace. "We should go to the ranch. If Blackstone arrives tomorrow, better if you're not easily found at the store." Grace nodded, suddenly overwhelmed by the enormity of what they'd done. She was married. To a man she'd known for less than 2 months. A man she cared for deeply but hadn't yet told she loved. Mrs. Holloway, perceptive as always, gave her a reassuring hug. "I'll mind the store, dear. You go with your husband now." She pressed a small bundle into Grace's hands. "Some things you might need. Rest can wait till tomorrow." The ride to the ranch passed in a blur of conflicting emotions for Grace. Married. The word kept repeating in her mind, alternately thrilling and terrifying her. By the time they reached the Broken Arrow, dusk was falling, bathing the land in golden light. "Welcome home," Lucas said softly as he helped her down from the wagon. "Home." The word resonated within her as she gazed at the sturdy log house. This was her home now. This man was her husband. The reality of it was still sinking in. Margaret and Jim Wilson greeted them with surprised delight when Lucas explained the sudden marriage. If they guessed at the urgency behind the hasty ceremony, they showed no sign of it, treating the news as cause for celebration. "Been waiting for this boy to settle down proper," Margaret declared, immediately setting about preparing a special dinner. "Though I expected a bit more warning." Over a meal of venison stew and fresh bread, they discussed strategies for dealing with Charles's arrival. Lucas was confident in his ability to protect Grace legally, but the emotional confrontation would be harder to shield her from. "You don't have to see him at all if you don't want to," he assured her. "Can stay here at the ranch while I deal with him in town." Grace shook her head. "No. I need to face him to end this properly." She straightened her shoulders. "I'm not the same frightened woman who fled Philadelphia, Lucas. I won't hide." Pride flashed in his eyes. "Never thought you would." He reached across the table to take her hand. "But you're not facing him alone. Remember that." After dinner, Margaret showed Grace to the main bedroom, Lucas's room, now theirs. The older woman had quickly made up the bed with fresh linens and placed a vase of wildflowers on the dresser, touching gestures that brought a lump to Grace's throat. "Thank you, Margaret," she said softly, "for making me feel welcome." The older woman patted her hand. "Been hoping for this day since Lucas first mentioned you. Never seen him look at anyone the way he looks at you." She moved toward the door. "You'll be good for each other, I think." Left alone, Grace explored the room that was now partially hers. It was simply furnished but comfortable, with a large bed, a dresser, and a small desk beneath the window. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes ranging from practical manuals on cattle breeding to well-worn copies of Shakespeare and Dickens. Everything spoke of Lucas practical, thoughtful, deeper than he first appeared. She was standing by the window, gazing out at the darkening prairie when Lucas entered. He hesitated in the doorway, his expression uncertain for the first time since she'd known him. "I can sleep in the spare room," he offered quietly, "if you'd prefer." The offer, made without pressure or expectation, confirmed what Grace already knew about this man. He would never demand what wasn't freely given, would never use her vulnerability against her. "This is your room," she said softly. "Your home. Our room now, our home." He remained by the door, giving her space. "But that doesn't mean, Grace, I meant what I said earlier. This is a real marriage to me, but I don't expect." He ran a hand through his hair, uncharacteristically flustered. "What I'm trying to say is there's no rush for anything, we have time." Grace felt a surge of affection for this strong, gentle man who was now her husband, who had married her partly to protect her, but also because he truly wanted her as his wife. "I may not be ready to say I love you yet," she said, crossing the room to stand before him, "but I'm not afraid to be your wife, Lucas, in every sense." His eyes darkened at her words, but still he hesitated. "Are you sure, Grace, after everything with Blackstone?" "I'm sure." She reached up to touch his face, feeling the rough texture of his beard against her palm. "Charles took many things from me, Lucas, my trust, my security, my home." Her voice strengthened. "But I won't let him take this too. I won't let fear of the past rob me of a future with you." Something fierce and protective flashed in Lucas's eyes. Slowly, giving her every opportunity to step away, he drew her into his arms. His kiss was different this time, deeper, hungrier, a promise of what was to come. Grace responded with a passion that surprised her, twining her arms around his neck as the last of her reservations melted away. Later, as they lay tangled together in the darkness, Lucas's arms holding her close against his chest, Grace finally gave voice to the feeling that had been growing within her for weeks. "I love you," she whispered against his skin. "I think maybe I have for longer than I was willing to admit." His arms tightened around her. "Say it again." She smiled in the darkness. "I love you, Lucas Young, and I love you, Grace Young." He pressed a kiss to her forehead. "Whatever comes tomorrow with Blackstone, remember that, we face it together." Morning brought a sense of peace Grace hadn't expected. Waking beside Lucas, seeing his face relaxed in sleep, felt right in a way she couldn't have anticipated. For the first time since fleeing Philadelphia, she felt truly safe. That safety was threatened all too soon. They had barely finished breakfast when Jim Wilson rode in from town with news. "Fancy Eastern fellow arrived on the morning stage," he reported, accepting a cup of coffee from Margaret. "Asking after a Miss Grace Calloway. Sheriff sent me to warn you." Lucas's expression hardened, but his voice remained calm. "Did he say what he wanted?" "Just that he had important business with the lady." Jim snorted. Looked down his nose at everyone like we was dirt under his fancy boots. Grace felt a familiar knot of anxiety forming in her stomach. "That sounds like Charles." Lucas reached across the table to take her hand. "You still want to face him?" She nodded, drawing strength from his touch. "Yes, I need to end this properly. Then we'll go together, as husband and wife." They rode into Oklahoma City an hour later, Grace seated before Lucas on his horse rather than taking the wagon. The physical closeness was comforting as they approached what promised to be a difficult confrontation. Sheriff Tanner was waiting for them outside the jailhouse, his expression grim. "He's at the hotel," he informed them. "Been asking all over town about Miss Calloway. So far, no one's mentioned Miss Cooper or any connection between the two." "Thank you, Sheriff," Lucas said, dismounting before helping Grace down. "Where is he now?" "Having breakfast at the hotel dining room last I saw." The sheriff hesitated. "He's got papers with him, Lucas. Says they're proof of theft." Grace felt her heart sink. "What kind of papers? Didn't see them myself, just what he claims." Tanner's gaze was sympathetic. "You sure you want to do this, madam? Could be ugly." "I'm sure," Grace replied, squaring her shoulders. "Better to face him directly than wait for him to find me." With Lucas at her side, Grace walked the short distance to the Oklahoma City Hotel, the town's only accommodation for travelers. a two-story wooden structure with pretensions of grandeur in its painted facade and curtained windows. Her heart pounded painfully against her ribs, but she kept her head high as they entered the small lobby. They found Charles Blackstone in the hotel dining room, immaculately dressed in an expensive suit that looked absurdly out of place in the frontier town. His dark hair was perfectly styled, his mustache precisely trimmed. He looked exactly as Grace remembered him, handsome in a cold, aristocratic way, with eyes that calculated rather than felt. He didn't notice their entrance immediately, focused as he was on cutting his steak with precise movements of his silver knife. When he finally looked up and saw Grace, the flash of triumph in his eyes made her stomach turn. "Grace," he said, setting down his cutlery and rising to his feet with fluid grace. "How convenient, I was just asking about you." "Hello, Charles," she replied, grateful that her voice remained steady despite the turmoil inside her. "I heard you were looking for me." His gaze flicked to Lucas, standing protectively at her side, then back to her. "I've been searching for months," he said, his tone suggesting she should be flattered by the effort. "You left quite suddenly." "I had my reasons." Charles's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Yes, well. There seems to have been a misunderstanding between us, one I've come to rectify." He gestured to the empty chairs at his table. "Won't you join me? We have much to discuss." Grace felt Lucas's hand at the small of her back, steady and reassuring. "Actually, Charles, anything you have to say to me can be said in front of my husband." The word hung in the air between them. Charles's perfect composure slipped for just a moment, shock and fury flashing across his face before he controlled it. "Husband." He repeated, his gaze hardening as it moved to Lucas. "How? Unexpected. And recent, I presume?" "Mr. Young," Lucas introduced himself, his tone civil but cold. "And yes, we were married yesterday." Charles's lip curled slightly. "How convenient, just as I arrived to reclaim what's mine." "I was never yours, Charles," Grace said firmly, "and nothing I took from Philadelphia belonged to you either." "I beg to differ." He reached into his jacket, extracting a folded document. "I have here a signed affidavit stating that several items of jewelry you took were family heirlooms on loan to you during our engagement. Items you had no right to sell or keep once that engagement ended." Grace felt the blood drain from her face. It was a lie. Every piece she'd taken had belonged either to her or to her mother. But if Charles had convinced others to lie for him, Lucas's voice cut through her rising panic. "Those papers mean nothing, Blackstone. As Grace's husband, any property she brought to our marriage is legally mine now. If you have a complaint, it's with me, not her." Charles's eyes narrowed. "This hasty marriage won't protect her." "It's clearly a ruse. It's clearly none of your business," Lucas interrupted, his tone dangerously quiet. "Now you have two choices. You can leave this town today and never contact my wife again, or you can pursue this matter legally, in which case I'll counter with charges of slander and harassment." "You think your frontier justice will intimidate me?" Charles sneered. "I have connections that reach far beyond this. Backwater." "And I have the truth," Grace said, finding her voice again. "The truth about what you did to my father, to our family, about how you courted me only to gain access to his business records, about how you offered to make me your mistress after destroying everything we had." Her voice rose slightly, carrying to the other diners who had fallen silent to watch the confrontation. "I wonder what your connections would think of that truth, Charles." A muscle twitched in Charles's jaw. "No one would believe such ridiculous accusations." "Your father's business failed because of his own incompetence. Maybe in Philadelphia they wouldn't believe her," Lucas said evenly. "But out here, a man's word and a woman's is judged by the character behind it." He looked pointedly around the room at the townspeople openly watching now. "These people know Grace. They've seen her work hard, live honestly. They know nothing about you except what they see right now, a man who'd track a woman halfway across the country to punish her for escaping him." Charles's face flushed with anger. "This is absurd. I came here to retrieve what is rightfully mine, no. Grace interrupted, suddenly tired of his lies. You came because you couldn't stand that I got away, that I refused to be another one of your victims, that I dared to build a new life without you. She stepped closer, emboldened by Lucas's presence at her side and the growing murmurs of support from the townspeople. I've been used and discarded, she said bitterly, loud enough for everyone to hear. By you, Charles. You used me to get to my father, then discarded me when I was no longer useful. And I'll treasure what others couldn't see, Lucas added quietly, his arm slipping around Grace's waist. Your courage, your strength, your heart. The simple declaration, echoing the words he'd spoken to her privately, brought tears to Grace's eyes. Charles looked between them, his expression calculating as he assessed the situation. The hostile glares from the other diners and the protective stance of the large cowboy beside Grace clearly gave him pause. This isn't over, he said finally, folding the document and returning it to his pocket. A hasty frontier marriage won't erase what you did. I did nothing wrong, Grace replied steadily. We both know that. The difference is I'm no longer afraid of you, Charles. She straightened her shoulders. The next stage east leaves in 2 hours. I suggest you be on it. For a moment she thought he might continue arguing, but Charles Blackstone was nothing if not pragmatic. Recognizing a losing battle, he gave a curt nod. You're not worth the trouble anyway, he said coldly. Enjoy your rustic life with your cowboy, Grace. I'm sure it's exactly what someone of your diminished circumstances deserves. With that parting shot, he threw some money on the table and stalked out of the dining room, his rigid posture betraying his fury. The silence that followed his departure lasted only moments before being broken by Sheriff Tanner's slow applause. Well done, Mrs. Young, he said, approaching from where he'd been watching by the door. Think you just ran that snake out of town more effectively than I could have. Grace sagged slightly against Lucas, the adrenaline of the confrontation leaving her shaky. Do you think he'll really leave? He'll leave, the sheriff assured her. I'll personally see him onto that eastbound stage. Man knows when he's beaten, even if he won't admit it. Lucas's arm tightened around her waist. You were magnificent, he murmured, pride evident in his voice. Brave as any soldier I ever knew. I was terrified, she admitted quietly. Being brave isn't about not feeling fear, Lucas replied. It's about facing it anyway, Mrs. Holloway pushed through the small crowd that had gathered, her face alight with satisfaction. I knew that fancy suit was hiding a rat, she declared. Good riddance to bad rubbish, I say, she hugged Grace impulsively. Now you two should celebrate. Your wedding day yesterday was all business. Today should be about joy. Word of the confrontation and the true circumstances behind Grace and Lucas's hasty marriage spread through Oklahoma City with the speed only possible in a small frontier town. By that evening, the general store was overflowing with well-wishers bearing gifts for the newlyweds. What began as an impromptu gathering evolved into an informal wedding celebration, with music, dancing, and enough food to feed half the territory. Never seen anything like it, Lucas murmured as they took a brief moment alone on the store's back porch. These people barely know us, but they're celebrating like we're family. I think we are family in a way, Grace replied, watching through the window as Mrs. Holloway directed the rearrangement of tables to make room for more guests. That's what I've come to love about this place. People stand together here. Lucas studied her face in the soft light spilling from the windows. Any regrets? About yesterday, Grace considered the question honestly. About marrying you, no, about the circumstances that rushed us into it, perhaps, she smiled up at him. I would have liked that sunset proposal you mentioned. A slow smile spread across Lucas's face. Who says you can't still have it? He reached into his pocket, withdrawing a small velvet pouch. Been carrying this around for weeks, waiting for the right moment. Grace's breath caught as he emptied the contents into his palm, a delicate gold ring set with a small but perfect diamond that caught the lamplight and fractured it into rainbow hues. Belonged to my grandmother, Lucas said softly. My mother gave it to me before she died, said to save it for when I found the right woman. He took her left hand, where a plain gold band already marked her as his wife. I know we did things backward, but... He dropped to one knee before her, the gesture so unexpected and touching that Grace felt tears spring to her eyes. Grace Cooper Young, he said, his voice deep with emotion. I married you yesterday for many reasons to protect you, yes, but mostly because I love you more than I thought it was possible to love another person. Would you do me the honor of continuing to be my wife? Not just on paper or for protection, but in heart and soul, for as long as we both shall live. Tears spilled down Grace's cheeks as she looked down at this strong, gentle man who had helped her rediscover her own courage. Yes, she whispered. Oh, Lucas, yes. He slid the diamond ring onto her finger, where it nestled against the plain wedding band, like it had always belonged there. When he rose to his feet and gathered her into his arms, their kiss held all the promise of the future stretching before them, a future built on trust, respect, and love freely given. The applause that erupted from the doorway startled them apart. Mrs. Holloway stood there beaming, with what appeared to be half the town behind her. About time he gave you a proper proposal, the older woman declared, wiping away a tear of her own. Now come inside, both of you. This is your wedding celebration after all. As they rejoined the gathering, accepting congratulations and well wishes from their neighbors and friends, Grace felt a sense of peace settle over her. The shadow Charles Blackstone had cast over her life was finally receding. In its place was the warm, golden light of belonging to this town, to these people, and most of all, to the man whose strong hand held hers as they moved through the crowd together. Later that night, as they rode back to the ranch beneath a canopy of stars, Grace leaned back against Lucas's chest, content in the circle of his arms. Happy, Mrs. Young? He asked, his voice a rumble she could feel against her back. Happier than I ever thought I'd be again, she answered honestly. You've given me so much, Lucas, a home, protection, love, his arms tightened around her. You've given me just as much purpose, joy. He pressed a kiss to her temple. A future worth building. As the lights of the Broken Arrow Ranch appeared in the distance, Grace thought about how far she had come from the frightened, heartbroken woman who had fled Philadelphia. She had lost so much: her father, her home, her place in society, but in that loss, she had found something infinitely more precious. Her own strength, a community that valued her for herself, and a love based not on advantage or appearance but on genuine respect and affection. I've been used and discarded, she had told Charles bitterly that morning. And I'll treasure what others couldn't see, Lucas had responded, a promise that she now knew with absolute certainty he would keep for all the days of their lives. In the years that followed, the Broken Arrow Ranch prospered under their joint care. Grace brought her organizational skills and business acumen to the operation, keeping meticulous records and suggesting improvements that increased their profitability. Lucas expanded their herd and their holdings, eventually making the Broken Arrow one of the most successful ranches in the territory. Their first child, a son they named James after Lucas's father, arrived just 10 months after their wedding. He was followed 2 years later by Elizabeth, named for Grace's mother, and then by William 3 years after that. The house that Lucas had built expanded to accommodate their growing family, with a new wing added to provide bedrooms for the children and a proper study for Grace. Mrs. Holloway eventually sold the general store and moved to a small cottage on the ranch property, becoming a beloved grandmother figure to the young children and a trusted confidante to Grace. Her presence was especially welcome during the long days when Lucas was out on the range, providing companionship and wisdom gained from her decades of frontier life. Oklahoma City grew from a raw frontier settlement into a proper town, and then into a bustling hub of commerce as the territory moved toward statehood. Grace and Lucas were respected figures in the community, their story of love triumphing over adversity becoming something of a local legend. And if, on occasion, a letter arrived from Philadelphia bearing news of Charles Blackstone's continuing decline in business and social standing, Grace read it with nothing more than a passing interest. The man who had once wielded such power over her emotions had become a footnote in her past, a painful chapter that had ultimately led her to the life and love she was meant to find. You ever regret it? Lucas asked her one evening, nearly 10 years after their wedding, as they sat on the porch of their expanded home, watching their children play in the yard. Leaving Philadelphia, all the comforts of that life. Grace considered the question, her gaze taking in the sturdy house they had built together, the thriving ranch that stretched toward the horizon, and the 3 healthy children who were the physical embodiment of their love. Not for a moment, she said, reaching for his hand. The diamond ring he'd given her still sparkled on her finger, now accompanied by the simple gold band that had bound them together in haste, but had proved stronger than either could have imagined. Everything I truly needed was waiting for me here. I just had to be brave enough to find it. Lucas brought her hand to his lips, the gesture as tender now as it had been the first time. "Treasure of my heart," he murmured, the phrase that had become his special name for her over the years. As the sun set over the Oklahoma prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson just as it had on the day Lucas had first brought her to this land, Grace Young knew with absolute certainty that she had found her true home not in a place, but in the love of a man who had seen her worth when she herself had forgotten it. She had indeed been used and discarded, but in Lucas, she had found someone who treasured what others couldn't see. And in that treasure, she had discovered a love strong enough to heal old wounds and build a future bright with promise and joy.